Theist millionaire mocks and humiliates elderly beggar, saying, "God doesn't exist and won't save you, you worthless old man." But then, something terrible happens. Larry was a man hardened by time and tragedy. Cold, proud, and arrogant, he made sure to demonstrate his indifference to the world and the people around him. However, he had not always been this way. Before the accident that took his wife's life, he had been a distant person, but not to the extent of despising everything and everyone like he did now. Although he was never exactly a good person, the Larry of the past still maintained some decency and humanity, something that was completely lost after the tragedy. As a millionaire and owner of a large company, Larry had all the resources needed to live in comfort and power. His fortune provided him with what many dreamed of: luxury cars, impressive real estate, and influence in the highest circles of society. But for him, all of this was merely an empty distraction, something he kept to reaffirm his superiority over others. But it did not fill the emptiness inside him. Faith, to him, was a laughable idea. Since he lost his wife, Larry came to see any belief as a useless device, something meant for the weak. To him, God did not exist, and life was nothing more than a cruel succession of random events. This cynicism distanced him even more from people whom he judged inferior, unworthy of his attention or respect. The only exception to this emotional armor was George, his 10-year-old son. With him, Larry revealed a completely different side: loving, protective, and dedicated. George was his only reason to keep living, the only human being capable of touching what was left of his heart. Even so, his relationship with the boy was marked by an almost suffocating protection, as if Larry feared that the same hand of fate that took his wife could also take his son. All the goodness that still resided in Larry was directed exclusively at George, while he despised any other form of connection with the outside world. That afternoon, Larry left his luxurious office at the company, his face serious as always, while his imposing presence made the employees fall silent the instant he passed by. He lived surrounded by efficiency and formality, demanding perfection from everyone around him, but maintaining an emotional abyss that no one could cross. As soon as he entered the lobby, one of his personal assistants, Mark, approached with George by his side. The boy was holding a colorful backpack, a stark contrast to the cold corporate environment. "Mr. Larry," said Mark, his voice careful, "I just picked up George from school, as you asked." "Great," replied Larry curtly. He briefly bent down, and his hardened expression softened as he looked at his son. "How was school today, George?" "It was cool, Daddy," the boy replied, smiling. Larry nodded, offering a rare smile. "Of course it was. You're a smart kid. Let's go. We need to head out." He stood up, adjusted his suit, and motioned for George to follow him. They walked together through the large glass door, ignoring the curious glances from the employees. Once outside, George looked at his father with bright eyes. "Daddy, can we get ice cream, please?" Larry hesitated for a moment. His days were usually planned with precision, but he couldn't say no to his son. "All right, let's go to the park. The ice cream cart should be there." They walked to the nearby park, a well-maintained area with wooden benches and tall trees providing pleasant shade. The ice cream cart was parked near a playground, and George ran ahead full of excitement. "I want chocolate with peanuts," he shouted to the vendor, looking curiously at the menu. He turned to Larry with a mischievous grin. "I've never tried peanuts, Daddy. I want to see if it's good." Larry reached his son's side, observing his enthusiasm. "Chocolate with peanuts, huh?" he commented, pulling some coins from his pocket. "All right, chocolate with peanuts for him, and vanilla for me." He handed the money to the vendor and ruffled George's hair while they waited. With the ice creams in hand, the two sat on a nearby bench. George savored his ice cream with joy, while Larry, less interested in the dessert, looked absent-mindedly around. The atmosphere was peaceful, with children playing and people walking their dogs. For a brief moment, Larry seemed relaxed. However, the persistent buzz of his phone broke the serenity. He sighed, grabbed the phone, and checked the number on the screen. "George," he said, putting his ice cream away, "stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. Don't leave this bench, okay?" "Okay, Daddy," George replied, swinging his feet carelessly. Larry stood up and walked to a more distant spot where he could take the call in private. He walked with firm steps, adjusting his tie and suit, maintaining the upright posture he always exhibited, even in moments of relaxation. Along the way, his eyes briefly landed on an old beggar sitting near a tree. The man was kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, eyes closed and his face peaceful. His appearance was worn, patched clothing and skin marked by time and a hard life. He seemed oblivious to the world, focused on his silent prayers, as if that brief spiritual connection was all that sustained him. Larry passed by him without slowing down. "Ridiculous," he murmured to himself, with a slight shake of his head. As he moved further to take the call, he stopped a few meters ahead, checked his phone again, and answered with his usual impatience. "Yes, I'm listening," said Larry, his voice authoritative and clear. He stayed there for a few minutes, giving firm instructions and discussing business strategies, completely ignoring the environment around him. Once the call ended, he put the phone back in his pocket and adjusted his suit once more, ready to return to George. However, before he could take his first step, the old beggar approached with wavering steps. The man stopped a respectful distance away, looking at Larry with eyes that, despite the harshness of life, held an unwavering kindness. "Sir, good afternoon," the beggar began, his voice rough but gentle. "Could you spare a few coins? Anything would make a difference." Larry frowned slightly but remained calm, although his tone was cold and cutting. "I have nothing for you. Go ask someone else," he said, already averting his gaze to indicate the conversation should end there. The beggar did not move. "Sorry, sir, but I've been having a very hard time. Any help would be a blessing." Larry turned back, his expression now marked with irritation. "I said I have nothing. Why do you insist? Can't you see you're wasting your time?" The old man lowered his eyes for a moment, but then met Larry's gaze again with a serene expression. "Sorry to bother you, sir, but I believe God blesses those who help others. He always repays." These words made Larry stop abruptly. He sighed heavily and turned completely toward the beggar, his eyes narrowing. "God? Is that what you're waiting for? For him to come down from heaven and save you? Tell me, if he's so powerful, why are you here begging on the ground in a park? Why doesn't he solve your problems?" The old man kept his calm gaze, but Larry took a step forward, his voice growing sharper. "I'll tell you why. Because he doesn't exist. If he did, he wouldn't waste his time on someone like you. Now here's some advice. Stop praying and go do something useful." Sir," began the beggar, still calm, "I just believe that—" "Don't finish that sentence," Larry interrupted, his anger growing visibly. "Useless old man, do you think prayers will get you out of this misery? Don't be pathetic. You're just another burden on the world, sitting there waiting for a miracle that will never come." The cruel words seemed to cut through the air, but the beggar did not retaliate. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as if he understood Larry's fury without being shaken by it. "I'm sorry if I caused you any trouble, sir," he said calmly. "That wasn't my intention." Larry shook his head, exasperated, and turned abruptly. He began walking back toward George, adjusting his suit with irritated gestures, as if wanting to rid himself of the unpleasant interaction. "May God bless you, sir. You need it more than I do," the beggar said in a firm but non-hostile tone from where he stood. Larry stopped for a brief moment, grinding his teeth. His fist clenched, but he said nothing. With one last look ahead, he continued walking, ignoring the words that, despite his apparent indifference, echoed uncomfortably in his mind. Larry returned to the park bench, finding George sitting calmly, watching the activity around. The ice cream had already been finished, and the boy seemed entertained by the children playing at the nearby playground. "Finished?" Larry asked, his voice serious but slightly softer when addressing his son. "Yes, Daddy," George replied with a shy smile, standing up promptly. "Let's go home?" "Yes, let's." Larry checked the watch on his wrist while adjusting his suit. "It's getting late." They walked together to the car, parked just outside the park. George got in first, sitting in the back seat, while Larry took the driver's seat. He adjusted the rearview mirror, sighed heavily, and muttered something inaudible to himself. "Damn it!" he suddenly exclaimed, lightly tapping the steering wheel. "What's wrong, Daddy?" George asked, curious. "I forgot my briefcase in the meeting room at the company," Larry said, clearly irritated with himself. He pressed his lips together, took the phone from his pocket, and quickly dialed a number. "George, stay here. It won't take long. I need to call someone to make sure they hold on to my briefcase." "Okay," the boy replied, leaning back against the seat, already used to his father's manner. Larry exited the car, walked to a quiet corner, and began speaking on the phone. However, the call took longer than expected, as the person on the other end seemed to have trouble locating the briefcase. When he finally hung up, he sighed again, ran a hand over his face, and returned to the car. As soon as he opened the door, he looked at George in the rearview mirror. "All right, we can go now," he said with a slight relieved smile. It was then that he heard a faint sound from the back seat. "Daddy." George's voice sounded weak, almost inaudible. Larry immediately turned around, his face hardening in concern. What he saw left him in shock. George's face was red, small spots were spreading across his skin, and the boy seemed to struggle to breathe. "George, what's happening?" Larry screamed, turning completely in the driver's seat. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out clearly. I'm dizzy and in pain," George murmured before his body went limp and he fainted in the seat. Larry's world fell apart at that instant. "No, no, no, George!" He rushed out of the car, opened the back door, and pulled his son into his arms, his hands shaking. "My son! Talk to me!" His words came out in broken sobs as tears started streaming down his face. He grabbed the phone with trembling hands and dialed emergency services. "My son is unconscious," he shouted to the dispatcher, his voice desperate. "He's red, with spots on his skin and not responding. Please send an ambulance now. We're at the park at the main entrance. Please, hurry." He hung up the phone and tried to calm down, but the reality hit him hard when he checked George's breathing. He wasn't breathing. "My God, he's not breathing!" Larry screamed into the emptiness, panic rising in his voice with every passing second. Carrying George in his arms, Larry ran through the park as if the world was collapsing around him. "Please, someone help me!" he shouted, his voice full of panic, trembling like never before. "My son isn't breathing. Is there a doctor here?" Desperation flowed from every word, and he looked around with wide, feverish eyes, hoping someone would appear, someone would know what to do. But all he found were static, confused faces, unable to react to the urgency he felt so intensely. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare, alone as time raced against him. "Please, someone help my son!" Larry shouted again, but his voice was already hoarse, broken. He stumbled on the sidewalk, falling to his knees with George still in his arms. Tears flowed freely down his face as he held the boy in a desperate grip, as if his son's life could slip away between his fingers. "George, please, come back to me," he murmured, his sobs shaking his body. He pressed his face into the boy's hair, his breath rapid and out of control. "My son, please, I can't lose you. I can't." His words were followed by anguished groans as he gently rocked George, as if he could bring him back with the touch of his hands. The weight of helplessness crushed Larry while he kept crying, calling out to the empty air for help. A crowd began to form around them, but no one seemed to know what to do. It was then that Larry heard hurried footsteps coming from behind. He looked up and saw the old beggar crossing the small crowd with an unusual determination for his humble appearance. "Let me help," the beggar said, kneeling beside Larry. He placed a hand on George's wrist and quickly assessed the situation. "This is a severe allergic reaction. He's in anaphylactic shock." "Can you help?" Larry asked desperately, looking at the man. "Please, do something." "I'll try," the beggar replied calmly, taking the boy from Larry's arms. He laid George down on the ground, gently tilting his head back to open his airway. "He needs to breathe." His voice was firm, yet urgent. The beggar began performing emergency maneuvers, pressing George's chest rhythmically while watching for signs of reaction. Larry was beside him, kneeling, hands covering his face, his eyes locked on his son. "Please, please, God, make him come back," he murmured softly, not realizing the irony of his words. After minutes that felt like eternity, George suddenly coughed, and his body moved slightly. He vomited soon after, gasping for air as his color began to return to normal. Larry's eyes widened, unable to believe what he was seeing. "George!" he shouted, moving closer and holding his son's hand. The boy slowly opened his eyes, coughing as he tried to breathe. Larry let out a sigh of relief and collapsed beside his son, tears flowing freely down his face. He squeezed George's hand tightly, as if afraid the boy would disappear again. However, his attention was soon caught by the man beside him, the old beggar, who was now slowly standing, wiping his trembling hands on his worn clothes. Larry stared at him, still out of breath, his face wet with tears. "How?" he asked, his voice rough and choked. "How did you do that? Who are you?" The beggar did not answer immediately. He seemed to weigh his words carefully while looking at George, who was still lying down, gradually recovering. After a moment, he spoke calmly. "I used to be someone else. Before I ended up on the streets, I had a life. I worked helping people. I learned how to do this. But today, God's hands guided mine." Larry blinked, stunned. He had not expected to hear something like that, especially after what had happened earlier. "God's hands," he repeated, almost automatically scoffing, but the doubt in his voice showed that he was no longer so sure of his disbelief. The old man looked directly into Larry's eyes, his expression serene yet filled with conviction. "Yes, sir. God doesn't abandon anyone, not even those who don't believe in him." Larry felt a lump in his throat. The beggar's words seemed to cut deep, exposing something he had buried long ago. "But after what I said to you, after how I treated you, why did you do this? Why did you help my son?" Larry's voice was full of confusion, as if he couldn't understand how someone he had humiliated so deeply could now save him in his moment of greatest despair. The beggar sighed, but didn't look away. "Because forgiveness is greater than hatred," he said, with a calm and wise tone that even the small crowd around seemed to absorb. "And because the boy is not to blame for the father's sins. Every life matters, sir. God teaches us that, even when we choose to ignore his lessons." Larry remained silent, staring at the ground. It was as though an avalanche of emotions had struck him all at once. Shame, regret, gratitude. He couldn't find the words. He simply lowered his head and squeezed George's hand tighter while the boy continued to breathe weakly but steadily. The sound of ambulance sirens brought Larry back to reality. He looked up, seeing the paramedics quickly approaching. "Here!" he shouted, standing up and pointing to George. The professionals acted with efficiency, examining the boy and preparing him to be transported. As the paramedics worked, Larry turned his gaze to the beggar. Something inside him wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a thank you, but the words simply wouldn't come out. When the paramedic signaled that he could accompany George, Larry turned one last time. The beggar remained still, watching everything with the same peaceful expression, as if he had already done everything he needed to do. Larry hesitated, but finally murmured, almost silently, "Thank you." Then he got into the ambulance, holding his son's hand. The ambulance door closed, and Larry cast one last glance through the window as the vehicle pulled away. The beggar was there, motionless, watching as they drove off. His serene face seemed to carry more wisdom than Larry was capable of understanding at that moment. Larry arrived at the hospital visibly tense, holding George's hand firmly until the paramedics needed to take him to the emergency room. He tried to follow, but was stopped by a nurse who gently asked him to wait in the waiting room. Leaning against the wall for a moment, he rubbed his face with both hands, trying to organize his thoughts, while the weight of what had happened crushed him. He sat in one of the chairs in the waiting room, unable to stay still. He looked at the clock every minute, every second, feeling like an eternity. George's pale and vulnerable face never left his mind. He also thought of the old beggar who had saved the boy's life, the words he had spoken, the forgiveness and wisdom he had shown. Every thought seemed like another stone in the mountain of emotions that Larry could barely carry. After hours that seemed like days, the emergency room door opened and a calm-faced doctor walked toward him. Larry immediately stood up, his heart racing. "My son. How is he?" he asked with a trembling voice. "Are you George's father?" the doctor confirmed, looking at the clipboard before continuing. "He suffered a severe allergic attack, but we were able to stabilize him. He's doing fine now." Larry exhaled the air that seemed trapped in his lungs. "Thank God," he murmured, almost not realizing what he was saying. "Has your son had allergic reactions before?" the doctor asked. "He's allergic to peanuts. Did you know about this? Did he eat anything with peanuts before falling ill?" Larry fell silent for a few moments, searching his memory. Then, like a flash, he remembered the ice cream flavor George had chosen at the park. He saw in his mind the small pieces of peanuts mixed in with the chocolate. He felt a tightness in his chest and rubbed his forehead. "I didn't know. He's never had a reaction before," he answered honestly, his voice thick with guilt. "But now that I know, I'll make sure this never happens again." The doctor nodded. "That's important. He's fine and will be able to go home in a few hours. For now, you can see him." Larry thanked the doctor with a firm handshake and went to the room where George was. Upon entering, he saw the boy lying down, still pale, but awake with a faint smile when he saw him. Larry quickly approached and hugged his son tightly, tears flowing again. "I'm sorry, George. I'm sorry for everything," Larry said, holding the boy against him. "I didn't know. I should have paid more attention." "It's okay, Daddy," George replied softly. "What happened?" "I just remember feeling dizzy," Larry explained, carefully choosing his words, not to scare him, but making sure to make it clear that they'd have to be cautious with food in the future. They talked for a few minutes, and Larry didn't let go of his son until he was discharged. When they left the hospital, he promised he would always be by the boy's side, taking care of him with even more attention. In the days that followed, Larry was tormented by thoughts of the old beggar. The man's words echoed in his mind, along with the image of his serenity, even in the face of all the disdain he had received. He reflected on how someone who seemed to have so little could show so much wisdom and compassion. After much thought, he decided he needed to find the man again, to thank him properly and try to understand more about his life. The next day, Larry went to a restaurant and ordered a special takeout lunch. He chose nutritious dishes with well-packaged containers, thinking that the beggar deserved something worthy of his kindness. With the package in hand, he headed to the park where everything had happened. When he arrived, he found the old beggar sitting in the same place where he had first seen him. His figure, hunched and serene, seemed to be praying again. Larry's heart began to race. He took a deep breath and walked slowly, holding the package firmly. "Sir?" Larry began hesitantly, his voice lower than usual. The beggar slowly looked up and recognized Larry with a slight smile. "I brought something for you. It's the least I can do." The old man accepted the food with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. But you didn't have to. You've already helped me more than you know." "No, I didn't help," Larry insisted, sitting beside him. "In fact, I was horrible to you. And still, you saved my son. I can't stop thinking about that." The beggar looked at him with patience. "It's not easy to forgive, sir, but it's necessary. Forgiveness isn't for those who wrong us. It's for those who need to move forward." Larry was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Then he asked, "What's your name?" "My name is Frank," replied the beggar with a calm smile. Larry and Frank sat together on the park bench, surrounded by the tranquility of the place. At first, the silence between them seemed uncomfortable, but Larry knew he needed to speak. He took a deep breath and looked at the man beside him, trying to understand how someone who appeared to have so little could exude so much peace. "Frank," Larry began, his voice soft, "how do you do it? How do you live like this with nothing and still have so much serenity? I don't understand." Frank turned to him, a gentle smile on his face. "It's funny that you say that," he replied calmly. "Many people look at me and think I have nothing. But to me, what really matters can't be measured in possessions or money." Larry frowned, clearly intrigued. "And what really matters then? Because honestly, looking at you, it seems like the whole world has turned its back on your life." Frank chuckled softly, but not mockingly. It was a laugh full of understanding. "The world may turn its back, but God never does. What matters is faith, inner peace, and the love we can offer others. Everything else is transient, sir. Money, status, comfort, all of that can disappear in an instant. The only thing that remains is what we carry here." He placed his hand on his heart. Larry turned his gaze away, as if Frank's words were uncomfortably accurate. "You talk about faith, but to me, faith seems like an excuse, something people make up to accept that life is cruel and unfair." "Is that really what you believe?" Frank asked, leaning slightly forward. "Or is it that the pain you carry doesn't let you see beyond it?" The question hit Larry like a blow. He lowered his head and fiddled with his fingers nervously. "I lost my wife years ago," he confessed, his voice trembling. "Since then, all I can see is how cruel life is. There was nothing I could do to save her, so how can I believe in a God who cares, a God who, as you say, never turns his back?" Frank nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "Loss is the hardest pain to bear, sir. I know that. Before I ended up where I am now, I also lost everything that mattered to me. My wife, my daughter, my home. I thought my life was over." Larry looked at him in surprise. "You had a family?" "Yes," Frank replied, with a melancholic smile. "And for a long time, I let myself be consumed by anger and pain, just like you. I kept asking myself, why did God allow this? But slowly I realized that it wasn't God who took things from us. It was life. God was there to help me endure." Larry stared at him, stunned. "How did you come to that conclusion?" he asked, genuinely curious, because, honestly, all of this seems like a way of deceiving yourself. "I thought that way too at first," Frank admitted. "But you know what changed? I realized that even in the middle of my suffering, there was always something or someone to remind me that I wasn't alone. A kind gesture, a comforting word. Every little thing was like a whisper from God saying, 'I'm still here.'" "Sir." Larry was silent, the words of Frank echoing in his mind. He thought of the moment the old man saved George, of the serenity with which he acted, despite all the disdain he had received. "And you think that's God? Those small gestures?" "Definitely," Frank replied with conviction. "God isn't a man in the sky, pulling strings as if we were puppets. He's in the simple things, in the love we feel for our children, in the kindness we can offer others, even when they treat us badly. He is the strength that keeps us standing when we think we can't continue." Larry ran his hand over his face, trying to hold back the emotions that were rising. "I don't know if I can believe that. I've spent so long protecting myself from the world, closing myself off from everything and everyone. It seems impossible to change." "It's not impossible," Frank said, placing his hand on Larry's shoulder. "Difficult, yes, but not impossible. You've already taken the first step by coming here and listening to me. The rest is just continuing to walk, one step at a time." Larry took a deep breath, feeling something inside him start to move, something he didn't know still existed. "Frank, I want to help you. I want to get you off the streets. I can buy a house, offer you a safe place. It's the least I can do." The old man smiled, shaking his head. "I appreciate your generosity, sir, but this is my place. Here, I find peace. Here I meet good people to help and people who need help. It's where I'm most useful." Larry was surprised. "How can you think your life is more useful here? You could have so much more." "Maybe," Frank replied calmly, "but what I have now is enough. Helping you and your son brought me more joy than any house could, and who knows, in the future, others may need me just as you did." The silence between them was filled with a sense of mutual understanding. Larry realized there were no more arguments. Frank was at peace, and Larry was starting to understand what that meant. After hours of conversation, Larry finally said goodbye, still reflecting on everything he had heard. As he walked back home, he felt restless. Frank's words echoed in his mind, as if each phrase was a silent challenge to rethink his choices. He knew something inside him had changed, but the resistance of years of pride and disbelief still made him hesitate. In the following days, Larry tried to continue his usual routine, but the image of Frank and what he represented wouldn't leave him in peace. He began to notice things he had once ignored: people asking for help on the streets, news of families going through hardships, anonymous faces carrying stories he had never cared to learn. Every detail seemed like a lost opportunity to make a difference, and it bothered him deeply. The first change came with a simple gesture. One morning, while walking downtown, Larry saw a man begging for money. For the first time in years, he stopped and handed over money without thinking twice. The man thanked him with a sincere smile, and Larry felt something new, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. As weeks passed, small gestures like that became more frequent. He began bringing food to homeless people and listening to their stories, understanding that each one was as complex as his own. With every interaction, he felt more human, more connected to something he had once considered irrelevant. Eventually, these small actions grew in scale. Larry decided to use his resources to support initiatives he had never imagined before. Funding shelters for the homeless, donating food to charities, and investing in educational projects for underprivileged communities. He didn't do this to redeem himself, but because for the first time he felt that he had the power to make a positive impact. At the same time, the changes in Larry reflected in his personal life. He began to dedicate more time to George, making a point of being a present and attentive father. Their conversations became more frequent and meaningful, and Larry started teaching his son the importance of empathy and compassion, values he was only beginning to understand. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but slowly, Larry became someone different, someone who, when looking in the mirror, could finally recognize a greater purpose than himself. Sometime later, when the changes in his life had become evident and solidified, Larry decided it was time to return to the park. Every day that passed, he felt more at peace, but he also knew he needed to share with Frank everything he had learned and accomplished since that transformative day. He prepared himself as if he were meeting an old friend, eager to express his gratitude and hear more of the wisdom that had touched him so deeply. When he arrived at the park, Larry searched for the old man in every corner. He walked by benches, gardens, and even the more secluded paths, but found no sign of Frank. He approached other homeless people who seemed to know the area, discreetly asking if anyone had seen an older man with grey hair and serene eyes. They all shook their heads negatively. Frank's absence was palpable. Tired but not discouraged, Larry returned to the bench where they had last talked. He sat there looking at the empty space beside him. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of children playing and the wind rustling through the trees. His heart, though initially filled with frustration at not finding Frank, began to calm. Maybe Frank had gone somewhere else, Larry thought. Maybe his mission here was complete, and he had found a new place where he could continue touching lives just like he had touched his. Larry leaned back on the bench and looked at the sky. The clouds moved slowly, and the blue seemed more vibrant than he remembered. A serene smile formed on his face. "Thank you, Frank," he murmured, his voice full of gratitude. "Wherever you are, I hope you know how much you changed my life." As he walked back home, Larry reflected on everything he had learned. Frank wasn't just a humble man who had saved his son. He was a reminder that true wealth isn't in material things, but in compassion, forgiveness, and the ability to see the humanity in others. Frank had shown him that even in the most unexpected places, we can find light, wisdom, and purpose. The months that followed not only transformed Larry, but also the people around him. He became a living example that it's never too late to change, that every act of kindness has the power to create a lasting impact. His new outlook on life became a legacy that he began to share with George and everyone he encountered. And as Larry continued his journey, always seeking to help and inspire others, he knew that in some way Frank was still with him. Not in physical presence, but in the lessons he had left, in the values Larry now carried in his heart. Because, as Frank had taught him, the true purpose isn't just to live, but to touch lives, one at a time, wherever the path may take us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.